Last box hit the porch steps at 9:23 on a Thursday morning. I know the exact time because I just looked at my watch before pulling into the driveway, thinking I had enough time to change my shirt before my daughter's school called back. Instead, I sat in the car and watched a stranger carry a cardboard box out of my front door and set it down next to 3 others that were already there. The stranger was my son-in-law. I'd been at the funeral home all morning. My wife of 31 years, Carol, had passed 4 days earlier. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks, which the doctor said was actually fast, as if that was supposed to make me feel something other than like the floor had dropped out from under me. 11 weeks. I barely had time to learn what the word palliative meant before I was choosing between mahogany and oak. I came home that Thursday to pick up the sport coat I was going to wear at the viewing. That was all. Get the coat, maybe eat something, go back. That was the plan. My son-in-law, my daughter Melissa's husband of 4 years, a man I had personally helped get a job at the engineering firm, where I knew the regional director, was standing on my porch with his sleeves rolled up and a look on his face that I can only describe as efficient, like he had a checklist, and he was getting through it. "What is this?" I asked. I didn't even get out of the car all the way. 1 foot on the driveway, 1 hand on the doorframe. He said my daughter needed me to give them some space right now. I said, I buried my wife 3 days ago. He said he understood that, and that it wasn't ideal timing, but that Melissa had been feeling crowded in the house, and that she thought it would be better if I found somewhere else to stay while they figured things out. I stood there on my own driveway, in front of the house I had owned for 26 years. The house where I had carried Carol through the front door after our wedding rehearsal dinner. As a joke, the house where we had brought our daughter home from the hospital, and I could not form a single word. The sport coat was in one of the boxes. I could see the dark sleeve hanging over the edge of the top flap. I took the coat. I got back in the car. I drove to the funeral home. I didn't cry until I was in the parking lot, and even then I wasn't sure what I was crying about. Carol, or the boxes, or the fact that my son-in-law's name was on the lease, because I had added him 2 years earlier when they offered to help me cover the property taxes, and I thought it was a kind gesture from family. There are things you do out of trust that you only understand much later. Carol and I had met when we were both 26, working at the same insurance company in Columbus, Ohio. She was in claims processing. I was in commercial accounts. She had this habit of eating lunch at her desk and reading paperback novels with the covers bent all the way back, and I thought it was the strangest, most endearing thing I had ever seen. I asked her once why she didn't just open the book normally, and she looked up at me with absolutely no expression and said, "Because then I'd need 2 hands." We were married 18 months later. We had Melissa. We moved to the house in Dayton when Melissa was 3, after I took a job managing accounts for a regional distribution company. Carol went back to work part-time when Melissa started school, eventually working her way into a senior analyst position at a non-profit that she genuinely loved. We were not wealthy people. We were comfortable people. We had a joint savings account, a modest retirement fund, a house with a paid-off mortgage, and a daughter we were proud of. Or so I thought. The visitation was on a Friday evening. I wore the sport coat. I stood at the front of a room at the Hendricks family funeral home and shook hands with people who had known Carol for decades. People from her office, from our old neighborhood, from the church we attended sporadically for about 15 years before life got busy. Her brother drove down from Michigan with his wife and 2 kids. My college roommate flew in from Portland, which I did not expect and which made me have to excuse myself for 5 minutes to collect myself in the men's room. Melissa came. She stood near the back for most of the evening. She hugged me once, briefly, and said her husband sent his condolences. He hadn't come. She said he had a work obligation. I said nothing. My brother Philip was there. He's 71, 3 years older than me, retired from the post office, lives about 40 minutes away in Centerville. He'd been calling me every single day since Carol passed, sometimes twice. He has a way of sitting next to you in silence that feels more supportive than anything anyone could say, and I have always been grateful for that particular quality in him. After the visitation, when the room was nearly empty, he sat next to me in the front row of chairs while the funeral home staff moved quietly around us. And he said, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" I told him about the boxes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're coming to my house." I didn't argue. I didn't have anywhere else to go. What I hadn't told Philip yet, what I hadn't told anyone, was what I had found 3 weeks before Carol died. She had asked me to look through the filing cabinet in the upstairs office to find her dental insurance card, because even in those last weeks she was concerned about a bill that had come in. I was going through the folders in the bottom drawer when I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, handwritten, and a set of documents I didn't immediately understand. The letter was from Carol's mother. Carol's mother had passed when Carol was 44. This letter was dated about 6 months before her death. In it, she wrote about a piece of land that had been in the family for 3 generations. 47 acres in rural Warren County, about 30 miles from where we lived. She wrote that she was leaving it to Carol and Carol alone. Not as a slight against anyone, but because Carol was the one who had always loved the land, who had spent summers there as a girl, who had once told her mother she wanted to be buried there someday. The documents were the deed, in Carol's name. 47 acres free and clear. I sat on the floor of that upstairs office for a long time. Not because I was upset, because I was trying to understand why Carol had never told me about it. We had been married for over 30 years. We talked about everything, or I thought we had. I brought it to her that afternoon. She was in the hospital bed we had rented for the living room by then, the one that cranked up so she could watch television without straining her neck. I sat on the edge of it and put the envelope on the blanket between us. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. "I was going to tell you when I was ready," she said. And then I ran out of time to be ready. She told me her mother had been very specific. The land was not to be sold. It was not to be developed. It had been in the family since her great-grandfather had farmed it, and even though nobody farmed it anymore, there were still 2 old barns on the property and a creek that ran along the eastern edge. Her mother had asked her to do something meaningful with it, something that would last. Carol had been thinking about it for years, she said. She had an idea. She wanted to turn it into a nature preserve and outdoor education center, a place where local schools could bring kids to learn about conservation, about native Ohio plants and animals, about what the land looked like before subdivisions and parking lots. She had even sketched out a rough plan in a notebook, which she made me get from the second shelf of the bookcase across the room. I read through 7 pages of her handwriting while she watched me. Floor plans for a small visitor center, a list of native plant species she wanted to restore, a name she had picked out, the Millard Creek Nature Center after the creek. "I was going to surprise you," she said. "I wanted to have it more figured out before I brought you in on it." I closed the notebook. I said, "You figured it out just fine." She died 9 days later, on a Tuesday, just before 4 in the morning. I was asleep in the chair next to her bed, the notebook on the end table beside me. Philip had gone home around midnight. The hospice nurse on call came within the hour. I sat with Carol for a long time after that, just the 2 of us, before I called anyone. I hadn't told Melissa about the land, not before the funeral, not during. There was part of me that needed to hold it for a while, to sit with what Carol had wanted and think about whether I was capable of doing it. I was 68 years old, retired from the distribution company after 30 years, with a knee that had been bothering me since a hiking trip in 2019, and absolutely no experience in nonprofit administration or land conservation. But I had Carol's notebook and I had her handwriting and I had 47 acres. After the visitation, after I moved into Philip's guest room with a single bag and my sport coat on a hanger, I called a real estate attorney I had used years before for a property dispute with a neighbor. His name was not on the deed. My daughter's name was not on the deed. and my son-in-law's name was certainly not on the deed. Inherited property left specifically to one spouse, never commingled into marital assets. In Ohio, law is generally considered separate property. I am not a lawyer, and I was not trying to be strategic. I was trying to understand what Carol had left and what I was obligated to protect. The attorney called me back 2 days after the funeral. He said, "The land is yours, and it's clean." I want to be honest about what I was feeling during those weeks, because I don't think I was feeling what most people might expect. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't calculating revenge. I was grieving Carol, eating cereal at Philip's kitchen table at odd hours, sleeping badly, and going through the notebook trying to understand whether her idea was actually achievable. Most mornings I would sit with my coffee and look up land conservation nonprofit formation on my phone, which I am not skilled at using, and end up reading about deer habitats by accident. Philip kept his opinions about Melissa and her husband mostly to himself, which I appreciated. But one evening he did say gently, "You know you have options, right? Legally." I told him I wasn't ready to think about that. What I was ready to think about was the Millard Creek Nature Center. I reached out to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Land Management Office. I reached out to a woman at the Miami University Extension Program who worked on rural conservation initiatives. I reached out to the principal at the elementary school Melissa had attended, who was still there after all these years and who cried a little on the phone when I told her what Carol had wanted to do. Word travels. Within about 3 weeks of those first calls, I had a meeting scheduled at a community room at the Centerville Public Library with 7 people, including 2 retired biology teachers, a civil engineer who had worked on park infrastructure for the county, a woman who ran a native plant nursery near Lebanon, and a gentleman named Chester who was 83 years old and had grown up on farmland adjacent to the property, and who showed up with a folder of old photographs of the land from the 1950s. Chester set those photos on the table, and every person in the room leaned forward at the same time. I gave a little talk. I am not a public speaker. I read most of it from notecards I had made from Carol's notebook, and at one point I had to stop for a moment, because I had gotten to the part where she wrote, "I want children to grow up knowing that something was here before them and will be here after." I collected myself. The civil engineer handed me a paper cup of water. After the meeting, a woman named Joanne, one of the retired biology teachers, walked out with me to the parking lot. She had taught middle school science for 32 years. She said, "Your wife had the right instincts. You've got enough land to do this properly. I'd like to help." I said I would appreciate that more than I could say. What happened next is not something I am proud of, in the sense that I don't enjoy anyone's pain, even the pain of someone who has hurt me. But I will tell you what happened because I think it matters to the story. Melissa called me about 6 weeks after the funeral. It was the first time she had called, not texted, since Carol died. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. We met at a diner near her house. She looked tired. She ordered tea and didn't drink much of it. She said things had been tense at home. She said her husband had been applying for a position with a company in Charlotte and it was looking like they might be moving. She said she wanted to make sure we were okay. I said, "I need to ask you something directly." She said, "Okay." I said, "Did you know about the land, your mother's land in Warren County?" She looked at her tea for a moment. Then she said her husband had mentioned something about it, that he had heard from someone, she didn't say who, that there might be property, that they had thought, given everything, that it might make sense for them to take a step back and reassess some things regarding the estate. I said, "He moved my boxes out of my own house while I was arranging your mother's burial." She didn't say anything. I said, "Your mother spent 20 years planning what she wanted to do with that land. I'm going to make sure it happens." She started to say something about how she hadn't known it was going to go the way it did, that she had been overwhelmed, that her husband had taken charge and she had let him. I said I believed her, and that I loved her, and that I needed more time before I could have a longer conversation. I paid for the tea and the coffee. I drove back to Philip's house. 3 weeks later, through the attorney, my son-in-law received formal documentation confirming that the 47 acres were separate inherited property, held solely in Carol's estate, and passing to me as the surviving spouse under the terms she had established. There was no marital claim. There was no grounds for dispute. He had moved my belongings out of my own home based on an assumption that had turned out to be wrong in every respect. Philip told me later that he had gotten a call from my son-in-law not long after the paperwork went through. He said the man had tried to talk around it for a few minutes and then gotten quiet. He didn't ask me what they'd talked about, and I didn't ask him either. The groundbreaking for the Millard Creek Nature Center was held on the third Saturday of October, which happened to be a perfect fall morning. The kind of October day Ohio sometimes produces, like an apology for all the gray weather. We had about 40 people there, including Chester with his folder of photographs, Joanne and her retired teacher network, 6 students from a 5th grade class at Melissa's old elementary school who had been learning about native ecosystems, and my college roommate who had flown back from Portland specifically because he said someone needed to be there who had known Carol before she was Carol to me. Philip stood beside me the whole morning. At one point, the kids were over by the creek, supervised by their teachers, peering at water striders and pulling cattails, and it got loud and chaotic in the best possible way. Philip leaned over and said quietly, she'd have something to say about all this. I said she'd say we needed more signage. He laughed. I did too. It was the first real laugh I'd had in months, and it felt like it had been waiting for the right moment. I moved back into my house in November. There had been some quiet legal correspondence about the lease arrangement, which resolved itself with a minimum of conflict after my attorney made some things clear. My son-in-law accepted a position in Charlotte. They moved before Thanksgiving. Melissa and I have been talking more, slowly, the way you do after something has cracked and you're both trying to figure out which pieces still fit. I don't know what will come of that. I hope something does. What I know is that on a Thursday morning in September, my son-in-law carried my belongings out of my own home while I was making arrangements for my wife's burial. He did it because he had heard about land that didn't belong to him, and he had calculated his odds, and he had acted on those calculations with a confidence that said he thought he knew something about how things were going to go. He was wrong. Carol knew this land was coming to her. She knew what she wanted to do with it. She had a notebook and 7 pages of plans and a name picked out, and the knowledge which she had earned over a lifetime of being the kind of person people trusted. That when the time came, the right people would show up in a library community room and lean forward over old photographs and say, "Yes, let's do this." She just didn't know it would be me standing at the front of that room. Every so often I drive out to the property in the evening when the light comes through the trees the way it does in October and makes everything look like something that should be remembered. I walk the path we've started cutting along the creek. I think about how she used to spend summers here as a girl, running through grass she probably didn't know she was storing up for later. I think about what it means to leave something behind that matters. And I think about the notebook, still on my nightstand, which I have not moved since the day she died, and which I am reasonably certain I will never move. Some things you just keep close. I've thought about that Thursday morning more times than I can count. The boxes on the porch steps. My sport coat sleeve hanging over the flap. My son-in-law with his sleeves rolled up like he had a job to finish. What strikes me now isn't the anger I felt in that moment, though I felt it, quietly. The way cold water is cold before you decide to say so. What strikes me is how certain he was. He had done the math. He had heard about land, made some assumptions, and acted on those assumptions with complete confidence. And that confidence was the thing that undid him, in the end. Not me. Not the attorney. His own certainty about something he hadn't bothered to actually verify. That's the thing about shortcuts in judgment. They feel efficient right up until they don't. Carol never took shortcuts. She spent 20 years thinking about what to do with 47 acres her mother left her. 20 years. She could have sold it, banked the money, and nobody would have faulted her for it. Instead, she filled 7 pages of a notebook with native plant species and floor plans for a visitor center, and a name she had chosen because the creek deserved one. That's not sentiment. That's a kind of moral seriousness that most people never develop, because it's easier to act on what's in front of you than to ask what you're actually responsible for. I didn't have that kind of clarity when she died. I had a notebook and a lot of grief and a guest room at my brother's house. What I did have, what I found out I had, slowly over those weeks, was the willingness to figure it out anyway, to call the county extension office not knowing what they'd say, to walk into a library community room and read from note cards in front of strangers, to let Chester put his old photographs on the table and just trust that the right people would lean in. That's not heroism. That's just not quitting. And I think for people my age, not quitting is sometimes the whole thing. You've already buried enough. You know what loss feels like. The question is whether you're going to let it be the last word, or whether you're going to get up from the chair next to the hospital bed, fold the notebook under your arm, and find out what you're still capable of. My son-in-law calculated wrong because he only looked at assets. He saw land, saw numbers, saw an old man who'd just lost his wife and probably wouldn't put up much of a fight. What he didn't see was that Carol had already handed me something worth more than 47 acres. She had handed me a reason to show up for something larger than my own grief. Melissa and I are still finding our way back to each other. I don't know how long that will take, but I know that at the groundbreaking, when the 5th graders were pulling cattails out of Millard Creek and laughing about the mud on their boots, I felt something that I can only describe as the future arriving. Not mine, specifically. Just the future. The one Carol wrote about in her notebook. The one where children grow up knowing something was here before them. She knew what she was doing. She always did. I'm just glad I finally caught up.